I met Hana Park on a rainy afternoon in the countryside of Red Willow, Wyoming, as she stood outside the old bus station, holding a torn suitcase and trying to hide her swollen eyes. She was an overweight foreign woman who had been mocked by the world, and once treated by a man as a burden instead of someone to love. I was only a middle-aged ranch owner, quiet and used to living alone. But when I brought her home to shelter from the rain, she looked at me with trembling eyes and whispered, "You are the first man who ever made me feel like I didn't have to disappear." From that moment on, I knew that no matter what happened, I would never let her stand alone again. My name is Samuel Reed. I'm 49 years old, and I never thought I'd stop my truck on a rainy late autumn afternoon in Red Willow, Wyoming, just because of a stranger. Red Willow is a small town squeezed between dry grass fields and red dirt roads. Summers are dusty. Winters strip the skin right off you with the wind. People here know one another too well, but they don't always understand one another. I have a modest ranch 4 miles outside town, a few dozen head of cattle, 2 horses, an old wooden barn, and a lot of silence. After my wife passed from cancer when I was 41, I lived alone. No remarriage, no looking for anyone. Folks around here call me Quiet Reed. They're not wrong. That afternoon, the rain was light but steady, the kind that turns the dirt roads to mud and pulls the sky down low like a gray blanket. I drove into town to buy barbed wire and coffee. As I passed the old bus station, I saw her. She stood pressed against a rusty iron post under a small tin shelter, hugging a worn brown suitcase. She was about 33, Korean, with a full, round figure, broad shoulders, and a soft, oval face. Her black hair was tied low at the nape of her neck. The coat she wore was too thin for Wyoming wind. The hem of her long skirt was muddy. Both hands gripped the suitcase handle as if everything she still owned in the world was inside it. What made me stop wasn't how she looked, it was how she stood. She was trying to make herself smaller, shrinking against the post like she was afraid her body took up too much space in the world. I've seen people stand like that before. My mother in front of my father when he was drunk. My wife in front of doctors when they told her she didn't have much time left. I pulled the truck over and rolled down the window. "You waiting for the bus?" She looked up, wary. Her English was clear but carried a soft Korean accent. "Yes." I glanced at the faded schedule board behind her. The route through Red Willow had stopped running 6 months ago. The whole town knew it. Strangers didn't. "No more buses come through here," I said. "Not for at least 6 months." She blinked, turned back to the board as if it had betrayed her. For a long moment she said nothing. Rain drummed on the tin roof. Wind tugged at her skirt. "Where are you trying to get?" I asked. She looked at me for a long time before answering. "Anywhere that isn't here." The words landed heavy between us. I stepped out of the truck, keeping my distance so she wouldn't feel cornered. "My name's Samuel Reed. I've got a small ranch just outside town. I don't know your story, and you don't have to tell it, but it's getting dark, the rain isn't letting up anytime soon, and this station isn't taking you anywhere." She looked down at her suitcase. "I don't have much money. I didn't ask for money. Why are you helping me?" "I'm not helping yet, I'm just telling you the truth." She hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. When she stepped down from the concrete ledge, her ankle wobbled. I offered my hand but stopped halfway. "Can I steady you?" She froze. Not because the question was big, but because maybe no one had ever asked before they touched her. She nodded once. I took her elbow gently. She trembled. It wasn't just the cold. People don't shake like that from cold alone. I walked her into Mabel's table, the little diner in town. Mabel didn't ask questions. She just handed over a dry towel, a cup of hot tea, and a bowl of chicken soup. "Sit down, honey," Mabel said. "Nobody gets kicked out here when it's raining." Hana sat at the table by the window. When Mabel set the soup in front of her, Hana picked up the spoon, then set it down again. Tears fell straight into the bowl. She wiped her face quickly. "I'm sorry." Mabel answered, "In my diner, tears don't cost extra." Hana gave a choked little laugh. I stood a short distance away, ready to leave once I knew she was safe. But then she said my name. "Mr. Reed?" I turned back. She looked at me through wet lashes, her voice so soft it almost dissolved into the sound of the rain. "You're the first person who makes me feel like I don't have to disappear." I stood still. Those words weren't a confession of love. They weren't ordinary gratitude. They were the first full breath someone takes after holding it for years. I didn't know what the right answer was, so I simply said, "Then don't disappear tonight. Eat the soup first." Hana stared at me, then she cried for real. Not the quiet, polite kind she had been trying to hide, but the deep, shaking kind that comes when someone finally stops pretending they're okay. Mabel rested a hand on her shoulder. I sat down at the next table, not too close, not too far. Outside, the rain kept falling over Red Willow. Inside that small diner, a Korean woman who had just stepped across the threshold of a story neither of us yet understood had begun to cry without apology. But right then, I made a silent promise to myself. No matter what happens, I will not let her stand alone in the rain again. Hana stayed at Mabel's little guest house that night. I paid for the room before she could protest, but I asked Mabel to tell her it was a debt she could repay by helping in the kitchen if she wanted. I didn't want her to feel bought or pitied. At 49, I had learned that kindness given the wrong way can make the person receiving it feel smaller. The next morning, I went back to the diner. I still had half a can of coffee at home, but I walked in anyway. Hana was sitting at the corner table, hair neatly combed, coat drying by the heater, a small notebook open in front of her. She was writing slowly, carefully, like each word cost her something. When she saw me, she paused. "Good morning, Mr. Reed." "Samuel is fine." She nodded. "Samuel." Mabel set a cup of coffee in front of me and jerked her chin toward Hana. "She wants work." Hana's cheeks flushed, but her voice was steady. "I can wash dishes, help in the kitchen, clean tables. I don't need much money, just a few days to figure out where I go next." Mabel folded her arms. "I need real help, but I pay real wages. No pity pay." Hana lifted her chin. "Then I accept." I saw something spark in her eyes then. Not happiness exactly, but the quiet relief of standing on her own feet again. Over the next few days, I learned her story in pieces. The way someone hands you broken glass and only gives you the sharp edges when they're sure you won't cut yourself. She was born in Busan, South Korea, moved to America with her parents when she was 12. They drifted through California, Idaho, and finally Denver. Her father worked warehouse jobs, her mother took in sewing. Hana learned English from afternoon cooking shows. She fell in love with kitchens because there the ingredients answered her fairly. Dough needed, long enough rises. Water, hot enough boils. Too much salt simply makes it salty. No one laughed at her accent inside a kitchen. She had been heavy since childhood. At school, they gave her cruel nicknames. At church, the Korean aunties told her she needed to lose weight if she wanted a husband. At work, customers would say, "You're pretty, but you should take better care of yourself," and smile like they had just given her valuable advice. So Hana learned to smile back. She learned to say yes. She learned to stand half a step behind everyone else in photos. She learned to wear dark clothes. She learned to eat little in front of others and finish what she wanted alone in the kitchen at midnight. She had been engaged once to a man named Richard Lane in Denver. He wasn't the kind of bad you could point at easily. He never hit her. He never yelled in public. He was polite, had a good job, knew how to say the right things in front of friends. But every day he made her smaller with soft, reasonable words. "I like you, but maybe you could try losing a little. You look better in black. Don't order dessert when we eat with my coworkers. I just want you to be the best version of yourself." The last one hurt the most because it sounded kind, but it really meant, the outside of you is something I have to overlook. She endured it for 2 years, until one night she overheard him on the phone with a friend. "I'm not sure I can marry her. She's nice, but walking beside her always feels like I have to explain something to people." Hana left the next morning. No fight, no thrown ring, no long letter. She packed a small bag, took what little savings she had, bought a bus ticket north, and kept riding until she got off in the wrong town because she was exhausted. That wrong town happened to be Red Willow. That was how she ended up here. I didn't hear the whole story at once. She gave it to me in quiet fragments, the way someone hands you pieces of broken glass, only when they trust you won't cut yourself. I never pushed, I just showed up. Some mornings I came to the diner to fix a light fixture or a loose table leg. Some afternoons Hana brought me a cup of barley tea she had brewed herself. She told me coffee was bad for the stomach. I told her in Wyoming, a man's stomach is made of cowhide. She laughed and said that proved my stomach needed a doctor. Slowly, the diner started to smell different. Light seaweed soup on Monday mornings, Korean potato pancakes mixed with American butter, cornbread with honey that sometimes burned at the edges, but customers kept asking for anyway. Mabel said one day, "That girl can cook. Samuel, if you stay single much longer, you're a fool." I nearly choked on my coffee. Hana turned away, cheeks burning. I didn't answer. Not because I felt nothing, but because I knew Hana didn't need a man walking into her life like a storm. She needed level ground. She needed time. She needed to breathe. But I had already started to love her. Not the kind of love that wants to save someone. I was past the age of confusing love with the role of hero. I loved the way she remembered Mr. Henderson liked his soup with less salt. I loved the way she saved the last piece of cake for the Miller boy without telling anyone. I loved the way she stood on the back porch every evening, looking out at the dark fields, as if she were practicing the belief that this place wouldn't send her away. One late afternoon, she walked out to my ranch to bring a lunchbox Mabel had packed for me. She stood on the wooden porch, looking at the fields and the horse corral. "It's so quiet here," she said. "Quiet enough sometimes you can hear the loneliness." She turned to me. "You say that like it's sad." "I've had a lot of practice living with sadness." She gave a small smile, then looked toward the horizon. "There were times I thought I didn't need happiness, just a place where no one would be ashamed of me for existing." I stood beside her, not looking at her too long. "You deserve more than that." She shook her head. "Don't say such pretty things, Samuel. I don't know what to do with pretty things yet." "Then I'll say something simple." "What?" "Here, you don't bother anyone." Hana looked down. I saw a tear fall onto the back of her hand. She wiped it away quickly, but I still saw it. I didn't offer big comfort. I just opened the door to the house. "The coffee I make is terrible, but it's warmer inside than on the porch." She looked at me, eyes still wet. Then she stepped inside. And my old wooden house, silent for 8 years except for the wind, heard for the first time the soft laugh of a woman because my coffee was that bad. After that first evening, Hana became part of Mabel's table the way a new piece of furniture slowly becomes part of a room. You don't notice it happening until one day you can't imagine the place without it. She worked quietly but steadily. She learned which regulars liked their coffee strong, which ones wanted their eggs over easy, and which ones needed a kind word more than food. The menu started to change in small, gentle ways. On Thursdays, there was a light seaweed soup that warmed you from the inside. On Fridays, she made Korean potato pancakes that even the old ranch hands admitted were better than anything they'd had in Cheyenne. Mabel would shake her head and mutter, "Girl's gonna put me out of business with how good she cooks," but she said it with a proud smile. Hana smiled more too, not the polite, careful smile she used to wear like armor. A real one. Small, sometimes shy, but it reached her eyes. I caught myself watching for it every time I stopped by the diner. The town noticed her, of course. Red Willow is small, people talk. I first heard the whispers at the hardware store while I was buying fence posts. Clara Benson was at the counter telling the clerk, "Samuel Reed's been spending an awful lot of time at Mabel's lately. That Korean girl, the heavy one, she's cooking for him now, you know." She lowered her voice like she was sharing a secret. "She's younger than him, but not by much. Still, a woman like that must be grateful someone's even looking." I stepped out from behind the aisle of nails. Clara's face went red when she saw me. "Clara," I said quietly, "if you're going to talk about Hana, at least say she cooks better than anyone in 3 counties and that Mabel's business is up 20% since she started. The rest isn't your business." Clara opened her mouth, closed it, and left without her change. I didn't tell Hana about that conversation. I figured she had spent enough of her life hearing what people said about her body and her choices. She didn't need me carrying their words to her door. But Hana already knew. People who have been talked about their whole lives develop a sixth sense for it. One evening, I found her sitting on the back steps behind the diner after closing, holding a cup of barley tea that had gone cold. The wind was picking up, carrying the smell of coming snow. "They're talking about us," she said when I sat down a respectful distance away. I nodded. "They are. Does it bother you?" "It bothers me that they think you should be grateful someone noticed you." She looked down at her hands. The wind tugged at her hair. "Richard used to say things like that too. not in those exact words. But the meaning was the same, that I should be thankful he was willing to overlook all of this. She gestured vaguely at herself. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice even. Hana, I don't overlook anything. I see all of you, and I like what I see. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said very softly, Samuel, do you like me? The question came so direct it caught me off guard. I looked at the muddy boots on my feet. Yes, I answered. I do. She drew in a shaky breath. I kept going before she could speak. I wasn't planning to say it tonight. I know you just got away from a man who made you feel small. I don't want to be another weight on you. She stared at her hands again. I don't know what I feel yet. You don't have to know right now. I'm scared that if you like me, it's because you feel sorry for me. I don't feel sorry for you. I'm scared that if you like me, it's because you're lonely. I am lonely, but you're not medicine for my loneliness. She looked up then, and something in her eyes looked both hurt and relieved at the same time. So what am I? I took my time answering because this one mattered. You're Hana, the woman who makes soup that warms people from the inside. The woman who laughs quietly when she thinks no one's listening. The woman who stands on the back porch in the rain like she's practicing believing she belongs here. The woman who still flinches when someone raises their voice, but who's learning not to disappear anyway. Her eyes filled. You remembered that? I think I'll remember it for the rest of my life. She turned her face away, not from anger, but from feeling too much. I didn't reach for her. After a while, she said, I can't answer you yet. I know, but I don't want you to leave. Then I'm staying right here. That was the first real agreement between us. No promises, no labels, just, I'm here. But the past doesn't like being replaced by peace. Richard showed up 2 weeks later. He drove a shiny black sedan into Red Willow on a Saturday morning and parked right in front of Mabel's table. He wore an expensive coat and shoes too clean for our dirt roads. His hair was perfectly combed. He looked like a man who was used to winning arguments before they even started. Hana was behind the counter pouring coffee for old Mr. Henderson when the bell above the door rang and Richard walked in. The coffee pot in her hand froze mid-pour. I was sitting at the window table. I knew who he was the second I saw him. Hana, he said, voice smooth and concerned, I finally found you. The whole diner went quiet. Hana set the pot down carefully. Richard. He looked around the little diner like he was grading it. You're working here? Yes. You stopped answering your phone. I didn't want to talk. Richard sighed the way a patient man sighs at a difficult child. You left so suddenly, I was worried. Hana said nothing. He stepped closer to the counter. We need to talk. You've misunderstood a lot of things. I stood up. Hana glanced at me quickly. A look that said, let me. I stayed where I was. Richard noticed. Who's this? A customer, I answered. He gave me a once-over, then turned back to Hana. Making friends with the locals? That's nice, but you can't hide here forever. I'm not hiding, Hana said. I left. You left our engagement? Yes. Hana, you're being too sensitive. I only said what needed to be said. If I didn't care, I would have let you embarrass yourself. Mabel's hand tightened on the counter behind the register. Hana took a slow breath. You think that was caring? And I think honesty is caring? No, you used honesty like a knife, then told me to thank you for not hiding the blade. The diner was completely silent now. Richard faltered for the first time. Hana, let's talk outside. No. Hana. I said no. That single word changed the air in the room. Richard looked around and realized too many people were watching. His polite smile tightened. He pulled a folder of papers from his coat and set it on the counter. I have a room at the guest house. Come see me tonight. We'll talk like adults. Hana stared at the folder. Her hands trembled, just slightly. I wanted to step forward so badly my boots felt nailed to the floor. But she lifted her chin. I'll look at the papers. If I owe anything, I'll pay my share. But I'm not meeting you alone. Hana, don't be childish. I'm not meeting you alone. Richard's smile turned thin. Then where's your lawyer? This diner? Mabel spoke from behind the counter, voice hard. No, but I have a nephew who's a lawyer in Cheyenne, and I sure do like making phone calls when someone bothers my staff. Richard looked around the room again. A couple of the older ranch hands had stood up, not threatening, just standing. He understood that Red Willow was small, but it wasn't empty. He picked up the folder, leaving one copy on the counter. You'll regret this, he told Hana. She looked him in the eye. I've already regretted enough. Richard left. When the door closed behind him, Hana stayed standing behind the counter for a long moment. Then she turned and walked into the kitchen. I waited a few minutes, then knocked lightly on the kitchen door. Hana? No answer. I opened it a crack. She was standing at the steel sink, both hands braced on the edge, head bowed. Her shoulders were shaking, but she wasn't making a sound. Can I come in? She nodded. I stepped inside and stopped a few feet away. I said no, she whispered. Yeah, you did. I was shaking so hard I thought I might fall over, but I said no. I saw. She turned around. Tears stood in her eyes. Are you disappointed? Because I'm still scared of him? I shook my head. No, being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you're scared and you say no anyway. She started crying then, the real kind, the kind that comes after you've held it together for too long. This time I asked, can I hold you? She looked at me for a long second, then she stepped forward. I wrapped my arms around her gently. She pressed her forehead against my chest and breathed like someone who had just run out of a burning house. She whispered into my shirt, You're the first person who ever made me believe my no has value. I closed my eyes. That sentence hurt more than any confession of love I'd ever heard. I answered quietly, It always had value. People just pretended not to hear it before. She cried a little longer. Outside, the diner slowly filled with voices again. But in that small kitchen, the two of us stood still, like two people who had just survived a storm no one else could see. Mabel called her nephew Laura Bennett, the lawyer in Cheyenne, the very next morning. 3 days later, Laura drove all the way to Red Willow in her dusty SUV. She sat with Hana at the corner table in the diner, papers spread out under the weak winter light coming through the window. I stayed at the counter, far enough not to crowd them, but close enough that Hana could see me if she needed. Laura spoke plainly, the way good lawyers do when they don't want to give false hope. Most of what Richard claims you owe isn't legally yours, she said. The lease was in both names, but you were never on the credit cards he says you used. There's one small joint debt from the apartment deposit, about $900. You can pay it in installments. There is zero legal reason for you to meet him privately or go back to Denver. Hana sat very still, hands folded tight in her lap. So he lied? Not a clean lie, Laura answered. People like him wrap a little truth around a lot of control. It's harder to fight because it feels half real. Hana nodded once. Slow. I watched the way her shoulders settled, like something heavy had finally been named. Richard didn't leave town. He stayed at the little guest house and started talking to people. At the feed store, he mentioned how unstable Hana had become. At the gas station, he said she had left during a mental health episode. In the bar, he told a couple of the older men, in that sad, reasonable voice, that Hana had always been insecure about her weight and sometimes misunderstood helpful advice as cruelty. Some folks believed him. He was clean-cut, well-spoken, drove a nice car. Hana was the quiet Korean woman who worked in a diner, carried extra weight, and kept to herself. In a small town, the story that sounds confident often wins first. I heard the whispers, but I didn't bring them to Hana. She already knew. People who have been whispered about their whole lives can feel the air change before a single word is spoken. On Sunday afternoon, Richard called a community talk at the little white church on the edge of town. He said it was to clear the air and protect Hana's reputation. And everyone understood what it really was. A stage. Hana found out Saturday night. She came to the ranch after closing. I was splitting kindling by the barn when her old truck rolled up. She got out wearing the same green dress she'd worn the day she spoke to Clara. She looked tired, but her back was straight. I'm going tomorrow, she said. You don't have to. I know, but if I don't, he keeps talking. And people keep listening. I'm tired of letting him write my story. I set the axe down. You want me there? She looked at me for a long time. Yes, but don't speak for me. No matter what he says, don't speak for me. I won't. Sunday morning, the church was fuller than it had been in months. Not for God, for gossip. Richard stood near the front in a gray suit, face arranged in concerned lines. When Hana walked in, heads turned. I walked beside her, not touching, not leading, just present. Richard started speaking first. He talked about how much he cared, how Hana was sensitive, how he only ever wanted the best for her. He said she had misunderstood his words, that she had run away during a difficult time, and that he was here to help her come home. When he looked at me, his eyes were cold. And some people in this town, he added softly, are taking advantage of a vulnerable woman. The church was dead quiet. Then Hana stood up. No one invited her. She simply walked to the front and turned to face everyone. Her hands were shaking at her sides, but her voice, when it came, was clear. I used to believe that if someone said they loved me, I had to become easier to love. The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. I used to believe that if my body made people uncomfortable, it was my fault. If my accent sounded strange, it was my fault. If I took up space, laughed too loud, or existed in a way that didn't fit someone else's picture, it was my fault. Richard's face tightened. Hana looked straight at him. Richard never hit me. He didn't need to. He made me thank him for not hiding how hard it was to love me. A few people looked down at their hands. I left because I finally heard my own voice again, and I am not going back to being the woman who apologizes for existing. She turned to the rest of the church. I'm not telling you this so you'll hate him. I'm telling you because maybe someone here has also heard a voice that made them feel small. I want that person to know not every soft word is kindness, not every I'm only saying this because I care is actually care. Her eyes found mine at the back. And there are people who don't promise to fix you. They just ask before they touch you. They listen when you say no. They don't make you feel like you have to disappear. Her voice cracked on the last word, but she kept going. I don't know what my life in Red Willow will look like, but I know I'm not going back to the person I was before. The church stayed silent. Richard tried to speak again, but Mabel stood up in the second row and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, I think we've heard enough. A few other people stood too, not in anger, just standing. Richard looked around, realized the room had turned, and left without another word. Hana stepped down from the front. When she reached me, she stopped. Her hands were still trembling. I was so scared, she whispered. But you stood, I said. She looked at me for a long second. Then, in front of the whole church, she reached out and took my hand. Not for Richard, not for the town. She took it because she finally believed she had the right to choose whose hand she held. After the Sunday at the church, Red Willow didn't suddenly become a kinder place. Small towns don't change that fast. Clara Benson still liked to talk. A few of the older men still made careless jokes. But something small and real had shifted. June Miller, a quiet widow who rarely spoke up, came into the diner the following Monday and asked Hana if she thought a woman her age could learn to drive a truck. Hana didn't laugh or give easy advice. She simply said, if you want to learn, your age doesn't get to answer for you. June left with her chin a little higher. A teenage girl who worked at the feed store slipped Hana a folded note that read, thank you for saying what I was too scared to say. Mabel hung a small sign behind the counter that read, here, the word no is respected. Hana stared at that sign for a long time the first time she saw it, then went back to work without a word. But I saw the way her shoulders stayed a fraction straighter after that. She moved out of Mabel's guest house and into the small room above the diner a few weeks later. I helped her paint the walls a soft cream color and build a simple shelf for her cookbooks. She paid me back with dinners, chicken stew with just enough heat, corn muffins with honey, barley tea that tasted like quiet evenings. We never called it dating, we simply kept showing up for each other. Some days were easy. Hana would laugh at my terrible coffee and tease me about the mud I tracked in. Other days, the old voices came back. She would close the door to her room and stay quiet for hours. On those days, I left a thermos of hot tea on the bottom step and a short note. I'm here if you want company. No pressure. She never had to explain. I never asked her to. One cold December evening, she came to the ranch after closing. I was splitting wood by lantern light. She stood at the edge of the circle of light, wearing the green dress again, the silver ring I had given her catching the glow. Samuel, she said. I set the axe down. She walked over and stopped just in front of me. I'm still scared sometimes. I still hear Richard's voice in my head telling me I should be grateful. I still look in the mirror and see the girl everyone told to take up less space. I waited. But when I'm with you, she continued, that voice gets quieter. Not gone, but quieter. And for the first time in my life, I don't feel like I have to apologize for existing. I reached out slowly and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. You never did. She took my hand and held it against her face for a moment. Then she said, I love you, Samuel. Not because you saved me, not because you're kind. I love you because when I'm with you, I remember I'm allowed to stay. I pulled her close, not too tight, just enough so she could feel I was solid and real. I love you too, Hana. Not the version I wish you were. Just you. The one who makes soup too spicy for half the town and still asks if they want more. The one who stands up even when her hands shake. The one who taught an old rancher that it's never too late to learn how to listen. She laughed softly into my coat. It was the kind of laugh that comes after tears have been cried and the air feels cleaner. We didn't rush anything. There was no big proposal in front of the whole town, no dramatic promises. Just two people who had both lost things deciding, day after day, to choose each other anyway. A year and a half after the rainy afternoon I first saw her at the old bus station, we stood there again, this time on a bright spring morning. The tin roof had been patched. Someone had added a wooden bench. Hana wore the same green dress, but now it looked different on her. Not because she had changed size, but because she no longer tried to disappear inside it. I took a small silver band from my pocket. Simple, no diamonds, just a single line engraved inside. Stay visible. I didn't kneel. I didn't make a speech. I simply held it out and said, this isn't a chain. It's a reminder. You get to stay. And if you ever forget, I'll be right here reminding you. Hana looked at the ring, then at me. Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. I'm not saying yes to marriage today, she said. I'm saying yes to staying, with you, in this town, in this life, even on the days I still feel like disappearing. She held out her hand. I slipped the ring on. It fit perfectly. We sat on the bench where she had once stood with her suitcase. The wind moved gently through the grass. A truck passed on the dirt road, kicking up a little dust. Somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed. Hana leaned her head on my shoulder. You know what I thought when I first got off that bus? She asked quietly. What? That I had made the worst mistake of my life coming here. I smiled. And now? She turned her hand so the ring caught the sunlight. Now I think this was the first place that ever let me stay without asking me to become smaller first. We sat there a long time, saying nothing. The kind of silence that feels full instead of empty. Later, when we walked back toward the diner, Mabel was already setting out the morning specials. A few locals nodded at us, some friendly, some still curious. It didn't matter. Hana didn't hurry her steps or shrink her shoulders. She walked beside me like a woman who had finally decided the world was big enough for all of her. And I walked beside her like a man who had learned that the best thing you can do for someone you love is to keep the light on and the door open, and to never, ever ask them to disappear again. Because some people spend their whole lives trying to take up less